So I got this question and it says, I'm not really understanding the baroreceptor reflex. I know that it can control blood pressure and like the speed of your heart, but I don't understand how the autonomic nervous system works with it, like sympathetic and parasympathetic stuff. I know that when you sit up too fast, that I think you meant TOO, like too fast, that your heart rate will slow down, but I don't get why that happens. I get that it's like a signal from stretching, but I don't know why that means to slow down or to speed up. So if we unpack some of this, right here where it says, I know that it can control blood pressure. Yes, it can. And the speed of your heart. Yes. And actually, with the baroreceptor reflex, these two are related in how it works. And then it says, I know that when you sit up too fast, your heart rate will slow down. Actually, it would do the opposite of that. So this is good. Let's talk about where these baroreceptors are at and how they do what they do. Okay, so what are these baroreceptors and where are they sitting? So this big guy right here is called the aortic arch, and it's part of the aorta. And the aorta is just a big, giant artery. It's a tube. And these baroreceptors, they kind of run throughout the circumference of the walls of this tube. And they are mechanoreceptors. You can also find them, I guess I won't draw over the whole thing, you get the idea. You can also find them in another spot, but I'm going to draw that ahead of time so you don't have to watch me draw all of it. Okay, so just to kind of orient ourselves, this would be the right side and the left side. In other words, like this heart right here is going to be facing you, like my eyes would be right here, and this would be my nose. And so if we were to draw a line right here down the middle, that's bisecting right and left. So coming off the top, this little guy right here is called the brachiocephalic artery because some of it goes out to your arm through the subclavian right here, and part of it goes up to your head. And this guy right here is called the common carotid. You don't really need to know the anatomy or memorize the anatomy, just so you know where we're talking. This guy right here is the external carotid, and this guy would be the internal carotid. Same thing on this side. This guy would be the external carotid, and this guy would be the internal carotid because, this is closer to the midline of my body. So now that we've got a frame of reference here, and I threw this guy out here just to be clear. This guy and this guy are kind of the same thing. This is the right subclavian, and that's the left subclavian. So now that we kind of have an idea of where we're talking, where else do these baroreceptors sit? So you can actually find them sitting like right here in the crotch between the external and the internal carotid. Same thing over here, which is interesting because now we've got them in the aortic arch and we've got them in this bisection or this division between the external and internal carotids. Does it really matter that they're sitting there? We just need them somewhere, and here is why. This is where they go. This is what they do. This is the interesting stuff. Okay, so how do these mechanoreceptors do what they do? How do they control blood pressure? What are these baroreceptors doing? So I've got my brain here. I'm going to move it over here, but we can still see the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and we're particularly interested in the medulla because these baroreceptors up here send afferent fibers over, and they kind of join up and go together. And they send them through a highway called cranial nerve number 9. There are other things going through cranial nerve number 9. It's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. But these guys use it as a way to get back to the brain. They send their afferent fibers back. And these baroreceptors down here in the aorta, they do pretty much the same thing, except for they use a different highway called cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. Put a little V for Vegas. So once they get there, they actually synapse in this thing called the cardiopulmonary center, regulatory center, or it's called different things, the cardiovascular regulatory center. They actually synapse on this little structure called the nucleus tractus solitarius, but the anatomy doesn't need to be memorized. But once they synapse here, now we can send effectors back. So this was afferent on the way there, and now on the way back, we can send efferent fibers back. And we're going to use the autonomic nervous system to do that. Specifically, we're going to use the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. So down here In red, I've got my sympathetic nervous system. Up here in blue, I've got my parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, I drew acetylcholine being this like orange color, and it releases acetylcholine here between the pre and post ganglia, and then at the effector tissue, it releases norepinephrine. The parasympathetic has this long preganglionic neuron, unlike the sympathetic and where it was short and then long. This one's long and then short. It releases acetylcholine at both ends. And so now we've got, like we said just a second ago, our afferent pathway going this way. I don't mean to draw that in red. I don't mean to say it's sympathetic. We'll say yellow. We've got an afferent pathway going this way. And these are our two efferent pathways. But I said two efferent pathways, which is interesting because I've got two possibilities. I could either speed the heart up with the sympathetic nervous system, or I could slow the heart down with the parasympathetic nervous system. And so what that means now is that I've got this very dynamic system where I can physiologically, depending on what these afferent receptors are telling me to do, what these guys are telling me to do, I can now, all these baroreceptors, now I can have a response. So what is it that they're constantly telling the brain to tell the heart to do? What is it that these mechanoreceptors, these baroreceptors, are so interested in? So you probably saw this coming, but baroreceptors are interested in measuring blood pressure. And so baro is Greek and it refers to weight or being heavy. And when I first heard that, I thought that was weird because weight and pressure aren't necessarily the same thing. But then I remembered that a force divided by area is equal to pressure. And barometers measure the weight of the entire atmosphere. And so that weight, which weight is a force, if you divide that by area, that's a pressure. And so barometers are measuring pressure provided by the atmosphere. And our baroreceptors are measuring pressure in our cardiovascular system, in our blood vessels. And that's really important to them, and it should be really important to you as well, because as it turns out, we carry a lot of oxygen in our blood. So this blood would be very richly oxygenated, and this blood would be poorly oxygenated. This blood, the second one that I just highlighted here, this guy, that would be like blood that you might find in a vein. And your cells need a lot of oxygen to not die, and that's kind of a talk for another day. But if your blood pressure is very low, you can't get that oxygen to them. And on the other end, if your blood pressure is way too high, then you can damage a lot of your organ systems, not the least of which being your very own cardiovascular system in the first place.